And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
I was muted. Good evening. I'm Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our monthly Patron Q&A for April 2022.
Yeah, welcome. Today we are going to be answering general D&D related questions submitted by our patrons. So there's not really a defining topic today. Monty and I have been hard at work, writing and doing all that stuff. So that's been really fun, but also been occupying a lot of our time. And so we just thought that we would take this month to just answer some fun questions about D&D. And as always, we want to thank all of our patrons who submitted questions. There were a lot. I think we had in the high 50s of questions, maybe even in the 60s. We tried to whittle it down as best we could. If we do not answer your questions that you submitted today, there's usually a chance that we found questions that were similar, or your questions actually alluded to things that we've covered in videos that we've released. When that happens, we tend to be like, well, we could answer this, but also we've already talked about it for half an hour. So you can probably go find that. So we're going to try to answer some of the questions that Monty and I have interesting new things to talk about, or also just topics that we love to dig into. At the end of the session, we will take questions from chat. When we announce that we're doing so, please put questions in all capitals, if you can, in the chat so that we can easily see them, pull them out, and answer as many of those as we can.
Yeah, most of the questions that we have tonight, actually, we did let our patrons submit any questions they wanted on any role-playing game related topics, but most of the questions that we got submitted were related to running the game, dungeon mastering, world building, and those sort of DM things. So we got a smattering of some player-focused questions, but we'll be focusing in on the GMing stuff. It seems that's what the patrons are looking for. So give the people what they want.
Indeed.
Yeah. So. Speaking with that, I think we should just dive right in. Yeah, Kelly?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, let's do it.
So question number 1 was submitted by Riley Biddle. And this question is, hey dudes, what are some of your favorite unusual spells that you think shine in the hands of a creative player? We all know how good polymorph is, but are there any diamonds hiding in the rough? Thanks. In my experience, there are lots of diamonds hiding in the rough, and oftentimes Monty and I have been proven wrong on spells that we thought were not that great or useful, that in the hands of a creative player have shown us just how great they can be. My prime examples are going to be Jill using Arcane Lock to great advantage in our game. And I feel like there was another one. Oh, when Jill again took Zephyr Strike, and we were like, don't take Zephyr Strike, take other spells. And Jill once again showed us that, those spells that she picks were always like, well, those aren't the best spells. And instead, she proves to us time and time again how useful those spells can be. And we should probably stop arguing with Joe and Jill about what they take, because they always prove to us. They always prove to us they always surprise us with the use of their spells.
Yeah, I think we've analyzed a lot of the spells in D&D 5e. And I have to say that there's a lot of creative players out there, and there's a lot of people that have thought creatively about many of the spells that are in the game. And I was speaking with Kelly about this, and I think that one of the things that kind of disappoints me sometimes is that there is this expectation that a creative player is going to find a spell in D&D 5e that is going to shock the group. And I think we've been far enough into the edition of D&D 5e that we haven't solved everything, but a lot of the shenanigans are well known at this stage, right? Like, So when it comes to finding a spell that is going to be interesting in the hands of a creative player, that creativity is going to really hinge on the specific situation for that spell to be good in. So Kelly's example of Jill using Arcane Lock to in the middle of a combat encounter is a great example of an instance where that was the perfect creative play for that spell, but it's hard to explain outside of that specific example. Oh, well, this is like, you should do it because Arcane Lock is going to be useful in this exact specific situation. And you go, well, that happened once in an entire campaign. And while the specter of it has come up, I think it's often that unexpectedness of the play with the specific spell. I also think that we have to be careful with spells, because spells, there's certain meme uses of spells that try to get a justification because it sounds creative. Like using create or destroy water on a water elemental sounds creative, but probably not necessarily the best thing. I think in general, though, the spells that I don't see used, the biggest ones that I just don't see used at all, and I think a really creative player could get a lot out of them, are creation and fabricate. I never see a player take those spells at all, like never. And like, I think that there probably could be some sort, like, that fabricate feels like a spell that you could actually build the character around, and you could actually start doing things with that, because like fabricate lets you convert raw materials into products of the same material. And the example is actually you could build a bridge from a clump of trees, right? And the spell says that you can't create items that ordinarily require a high degree of craftsmanship, such as jewelry, weapons, glass, or armor, unless you already have proficiency with the type of artisan's tools used to craft such objects. So I feel like there's some...
artificer with fabricate?
Well, no, because it's a 4th level spell. So artificers don't get it till late. I think a forge domain cleric or a wizard with a ton of tool proficiencies, and a bunch of bags of holding, because you have to have the raw materials, right? And that is the really, really tough thing with it, is that, like, I don't know, again, like, I've been playing a bunch of video games like Satisfactory and Valheim recently, right? But I'm mentioning this because, like, but it even calls back to Fortnite. Like, I played a little bit of Fortnite. I'm hip, I'm cool, I'm one of the kids. And, like, in those games, one of the really simple things that you can do in those video games is your character can build a wall, but you can also build a wooden ramp. Like, you just build this, like, block ramp and you can use the ramps with your character to ascend and, like, navigate the map and navigate the world. And I'm thinking, like, obviously a character in D&D can't carry as much wood as, like, a video game character can in Valheim or whatever. So it doesn't work the same way. But I wonder if there's something in that, in, like, playing a character that has a bag of holding filled with raw lumber.
To build bridges?
Yes, to build bridges, right? Like I think, like, it's a weird thing that probably, like, because like, if the character was proficient in like carpenter's tools and woodworking supplies, and had a bag of holding filled with, like, wood, I think you could,
Okay, so if I have fabricate and I am proficient in carpenter's tools, would you allow me to make a trebuchet or catapult out of a pile of wood?
Like, what's under what grounds can you say no? and especially like if the character is not just like, imagine a character who's not just proficient in carpenter's tools, but is proficient in like a bunch of engineering tools and has like all these knowledge skills. Like, clearly they have the expertise to build a trebuchet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Or build a ballista. Right. So.
One final note about this question that I actually want to mention, and this is going to be what I'm about to say is geared towards newer players. So if you're already well past this point in your D&D career, then you already know this. But when we're talking about hidden gems of spells, I think a problem that a lot of new players make, and I've experienced this with every new player that's ever gotten into D&D, is when they look at spells, they see something like Fireball and they say, okay, well, Fireball is the best spell in the game. I get to roll a bunch of dice and everything in that area dies. But then they see a spell like Hypnotic Pattern and they go, oh, it does no damage? Why would I take that spell? Mm-hmm. And I think that for new players, if you're wondering what spells are much better than you suspect they will be, look at area of effect spells that do a buff or debuff or a status effect on a group of creatures.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's the game-changing play that's better than dropping a fireball. Sometimes fairy fire is better than dropping a fireball if you have the right party dynamic. If you have a bunch of people that if they have advantage on every attack can hit really, really hard and kill everything in that area, and you drop fairy fire giving your whole party advantage, you kind of just won the combat encounter. If you drop Hypnotic Pattern and everybody becomes incapacitated, you just won the combat encounter. And I think a lot of new players steer themselves towards damage dealing spells when really there's a lot to be gained by looking at buffs, debuffs, and battlefield control.
I agree. Moving along, Momo Alaska asks, I recently hosted my very first session as DM. Congratulations! I hope
Congrats.
It went... I intentionally went in a little unprepared, as I knew I wouldn't be able to even prepare right until I had my legs under me, so to speak. That makes sense. You don't tell us how it goes, but you ask, what's the most unprepared you felt at a session, and how did it go?
Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first? I have a story.
Okay, what's your story?
All right. My most unprepared session ended up being one of the most memorable sessions I ever ran. I had a session, the only thing that I prepared, and I knew that it was going to be a challenge, but we ended the week before with my party deciding that they were going to go celebrate a victory by going drinking at their favorite tavern with all their favorite NPCs. And they were like, we're going to party because we just beat a major villain. There's a few weeks of downtime. Let's do that. I didn't really know what to do the next session. So I literally just wrote, roll on the carousing table. And that was my whole prep for the session. I didn't know what I was going to do. But what happened is I had every player roll on the carousing table. And I wrote down the answers, looked at the page, and strung together a narrative. And somehow we ended up in a situation where one of the player characters woke up in the royal palace in like one of the knights' bedrooms. Another person woke up dressed in a suit with a note with a time and a church location on, and they were going to a funeral of another person who had been incapacitated the night before, mistaken for dead. Another person woke up in the woods surrounded by wolves with no clothes on. And there was like one or two other weird things that happened. And everybody woke up in these random locations. They had to come back together. And I improv'd on the spot this like weird narrative and plot that like tied together. That we almost ended up doing The Hangover. It was like they had to piece together what happened to all of them and what were the events that got them to this location. And there were so many memorable moments from that session. And it was actually probably the first time. It was a very big confidence booster for me as a DM because I left that session with my players talking about it, and they still talk about it. And that was the first time that I was like, I just made everything up during the session and it went that well.
Good stuff.
So it was a big confidence booster, and sometimes letting go of the reins and just working with your players to see where things go can be a really rewarding experience.
Yeah, I think for me, my underprepared story really comes from the epic time when a bunch of people canceled last minute, and Kelly, you and Joe were the only ones to come.
I know.
And so so basically, for me, that was a situation where I was prepared for something completely different, and the game prep just got thrown in the garbage because only 2 players showed up. But we were able to play, and I just like, you do reach a certain point with the game prep where when you know your world and you know what you can riff on, where you can kind of give the players the reins and let them do whatever chaotic thing they want to do and find out what happens. And in this case, Kelly and Joe were playing a druid and a wizard, and they decided to make a portal to hell and see what they could find there. And we just went with it, and it was great. We played for hours and hours, and I just was making stuff up as I went along and drawing on whatever, depictions I had in my mind, and it was great. Like, it was kind of just coming out of nowhere. And sometimes that that really free-flowing improv is very empowering. And I think since then, I've always remembered that I can trust my players when I'm feeling underprepared, and that I mean, I've experienced players, so that's definitely a different thing, right? But you always still can fall back on that and ask them, even when you have newer players, asking them what they want to do and seeing what happens and seeing what they do. All you need to do is roll on a table and flip to a random page in the monster manual, and you can get something cooking. Like, it's very surprising how it is a skill that takes time, but eventually you get to a point where you need less prep. You don't need as much, because you know what you know yourself, what you are capable of imagining. And I definitely think for me, one of the big transitions too with like requiring less prep was like, incidentally, playing online makes the prep a little bit more, because I'm a very map centric DM. So for me, like, it's actually very important. Like, most recently, I felt most unprepared when I'm like, oh, I don't have all the maps that I might possibly need ready to go, because whereas when we play in person, I have a lot of terrain and I have a lot of scenery and I have maps and markers and miniatures, and it's actually very easy for me to be like, oh, you guys are going here, here's some Dwarven Forge stuff, here's some miniatures, here's some model trees, and I can actually throw something together really, really quickly with the scenery if I need that physical representation. But if you need a physical representation for combat in an online space, it's a much bigger challenge, especially if you want to have a colorful map.
I think the other thing that we learned from that is that you can never let Joe and myself play alone. We do terrible, terrible things when that happens. Moving on to the next question from RM147. How do you decide when to end a campaign? I think that this is a tough question, but Monty, do you have an idea of what the solid answer to that is?
I think that it's more art than science. I think that if first of all, like, if you are sick of a campaign, like if you are not enjoying the campaign anymore, it might be worthwhile just ending it flat out and not finishing it, because I'm gonna interpret the question meaning, like, how do you know when the story is finished? Like, the characters ride off into the sunset, and that's the end of that's the end of the story, not you're stopping playing D&D together because of scheduling nightmares. Because I'll be honest, most campaigns end because of scheduling.
It's true.
Most campaigns do not die a natural death with a big conclusion. I think a lot of them kind of tend to peter out, at least in my experience. But how do you I think you can get to a point where you can think of the structure of a film, where in many films they approach the climax because they complication. So ending a campaign is about stopping adding new problems.
Yeah.
You have to stop adding new problems and new obstacles and let the players focus on actually overcoming them. There are no more lieutenants to defeat. There are no more artifacts that need to be collected. There are no more allies that need to be entreated. There are no more. There are no further preparations that can be done. It is time for the final battle, and focus then on resolving those things. It's not necessary to resolve every single plot thread. There are a lot of television shows, movies, books, novels, comic books, video games, and published campaigns that do not resolve every single narrative thread that they threw out there. You don't have to resolve every single thing. You probably should try to make sure that each of your player characters gets a good resolution. And I think one of the things that you can kind of do is you can have, as you approach the final arc of your campaign, you can have a session re-zero where you ask your players, like, what does it mean for your characters to achieve their objectives? What do you think your character would do if they won? What do you think if their battles were over? What would they do? And also ask them, what are the things that they want to finish? And as you ask them these questions and get these answers, you'll be able to see what are the things that you need to hit for each of your players in order to offer them a satisfying conclusion. Because I think that that's the biggest thing, is that when you're ending a campaign, you want it to feel satisfying. You whether or not the players win or lose, whether or not the heroes are defeated, whether or not the ending is bittersweet, you want it to be a satisfying conclusion to the story, one that leaves it on an endpoint. And the best way to do that is to talk to your players and get a sense of what the ending means for their character, right? Maybe it turns out that one of your players is like, I wanted my character to open a military academy, or I want my character to build a stronghold. I want my character to finally make amends with their family. Know what matters to the individual characters so that you can hit those points by the end, and then you'll be fine.
I have, like, it's weird because I don't know if anybody else does this, but when I'm designing a campaign, I used to write scripts and screenplays, and I did the same thing then. I actually usually think of my ending first. The way that I build a campaign is I usually think of the ending, the beginning, and then the middle stuff is all going to be loose ideas and improv. And so right from the get-go, I usually know where I'm trying to steer the narrative towards. And so I know where I want the conclusion to be. Sometimes there's the big bad evil guy. Sometimes there's the major conflict that needs to be resolved, the major issue. And really, I just know that, like, once major issue is resolved, then we do like a wrap-up session where we tie up loose ends, and then that's the end of my campaign. But for me, the more confusing part is what's going to happen in the middle. I'm homebrewing a campaign right now, and I already know where it ends. And now we've been playing for like 3 months, and only now am I like, oh, maybe they have to collect these things and do this and stop this ritual, and then they get to the ending. Okay, cool. But I've known who the main bad guy is and what this is all building towards for a long time. I just had to figure out how the players actually interact with that. So for me, knowing when it ends has always been easier than knowing how to get them there.
See, for me, I like the stuff in the middle. Right?
I mean, I like it, but I improv a lot of it.
Yeah, I find for myself, I don't know how our campaigns are going to end, right? Like, but it does depend. Like, obviously, it's easier to know when you're going to run when the campaign's going to end if you're running a pre-made adventure, because it has the destination for you.
Yeah.
Right. So it depends.
Shugyosha asks, how often do you adjudicate minor buffs to parties, such as lightning boosts in the rain, bonus from eating an amazing soup, or having a strong exotic drink and not getting drunk from it, or similar scenarios? And what do these buffs look like? I think in general, when you are thinking of this stuff, you want to err on the side of less is more. Like if you go too big with these, then it becomes something that they can reliably do too often. If you make, I'm going to tell you what not to do, and then I think Monty actually has some great points about what to do. But what not to do is, make like a soup basically the equivalent of Hero's Feast. It's way too powerful.
Yeah.
Gonna add too many buffs, so don't do things like that. Also, like, if somebody casts a lightning spell and there's a thunderstorm, they immediately get to double the power. Probably not, but maybe by adding a little bit extra. I think if we look at like adding some temporary hit points, or maybe looking at the damage table that's on most of the DM screens, that's like environmental damage by level, you could maybe add like extra lightning damage if there's a thunderstorm going on and somebody casts a lightning spell that's equal to the value of the level that they're playing at. So those are some ideas. Monty, what do you think?
I think I agree, like less is more for sure. Unless it's something that just will never be repeated again, right? I think that bonus also set the bar in the right place for what triggers these buffs, right? Like, I don't know if I would necessarily make lightning damage more effective in a rainstorm. I don't know if I would necessarily do that. I don't know if I would necessarily make an amazing soup give some sort of buff, or not getting drunk after drinking. Like, I don't know if these necessarily hit my bar. I think my bar for what constitutes a buff is a little bit higher, especially when it comes to the eating and drinking of things. I think that's where like potions come into play. And one way to actually do it is to actually just treat them like potions. Right? Just say this food cooked by this person in this context is like imbibing a potion. So you could actually just say that it is treated in that way, and it costs as much, right? On the flip side, I do think that small amounts of temporary hit points, like 5 or 10, is fine for like a really amazing meal in a very like great situation. I think another interesting thing with damage is that you can always say that damage die, you can let someone reroll ones on damage die, which is kind of like it's subtle. Like usually it'll end up adding like 5 damage tops, but it feels impactful. You can always do something as well where like advantage is your friend. You can hand out advantage or disadvantage as necessary. Or one of the things that you can do is you can give players the opportunity to automatically succeed a saving throw related to a specific ability score once in the next however long period, right? What I would do with all of these things is make them things that expire. Like, not make them things that are indefinite. Like the food buff, it's like you get one little benefit. There used to be this cool thing in D&D Adventures League where you could give somebody a +1. Like they had these cards that you could use to get extra benefits, but one of the ways that they worked was that you could give a card to another player to give them +1 to a die roll, and the +1 could be used even after you rolled the dice and saw and like, but before the result was announced. And that was kind of cool. Like, it was just like, it was like this bonus of like saying like, anytime you can add +1 to any die roll as if you just rolled one number higher on the die. That might be not a standard type of thing in D&D 5e, but kind of cool.
The next question is from Terrasque. No, it's Tarask. What advice would you give for role-playing and managing an extremely intelligent NPC? Example, the Queen of Thieves or Strahd von Zarovich. How do you manage the inevitable, unexpected player shenanigans as an NPC who always has a plan? My answer to this, as a DM, you need to walk this very fine line, and it's very important to have an equal balance of roleplay and metagame. As a DM, we have the power to metagame. We have the power to know how to stump our players and kind of control over a lot of the situations. And we have advanced knowledge of the setting, world, and things that most NPCs wouldn't know about the players. If you're playing an extremely intelligent character and they have the means to spy on the party, they have maybe familiars who you can say, like, you know, the party sees like a pack of wolves go by, and the wolves are actually minions of Strahd von Zarovich. Wow. Really wanted a different vampire there. Strahd von Zarovich. Then all of a sudden, like, if they have scrying, if they have other means of spying, then you can kind of use a metagame approach to fool the players, because the bad guy knows more about the players than an average NPC would. And at this point, if they've been being observed, you can technically read their character sheets, see what spells they have, learn their tactics through combat encounters. What do most people usually do? Does the barbarian always run in towards the biggest target? Does the wizard always cast Force Cage first? You know, like, once you start to kind of see these patterns, you can prepare your NPC who always knows what's up by having countermeasures to these exact plays. Still have them be defeatable, but what's great is creating a really intelligent NPC where the player characters need to do things differently than they normally do in order to outsmart them. They need to fool the NPC by surprising them. So I think that that's a really cool way to go. But you do need to role play your metagame. You can't just be like, well, you know, the Queen of Thieves knows everything about you, and so she counterspells all of your spells, and she actually can't be banished, because, like, those might be built in, but you want to build them into the role play and have in-game reasons for why they're so smart, intelligent, and well-informed.
It also depends on the villain, because I'll just say the Queen of Thieves and Strahd von Zarovich are very different plotters. Like, the Queen of Thieves I feel like with the Queen of Thieves, you can actually get away with a lot more. Like, I can get away with more with her than I could with Strahd von Zarovich, because I feel like Strahd is not as crafty as the Queen of Thieves in terms of he's a different kind of paranoid. You know what I mean? Like, they're different people in a lot of respects. I will, echoing Kelly's sentiment, one of the things that I do with the Queen of Thieves all the time, and if you really watch closely, you'll notice this. I often have the Queen of Thieves appear towards the end of a game session so that I can end the session on a cliffhanger and give myself an extra week to think about what she's gonna do.
Sometimes even 6 weeks.
And then And that kind of lets you have the benefit of hindsight to be like, okay, the players have done X, Y, and Z, and you have to ask yourself the real honest question. This is a hard one. Is there any way the villain would have seen that coming? Like, and what would they have been planning for in this? Because I have to say, it's a huge tightrope to walk, because sometimes you get away with it and your players are like, wow, that was a masterstroke. And sometimes they're like very frustrated. So you have to know your players and what they're game for, because there's a very fine line with a villain who is a master plotter can't win every single time, because if they do, the players will get frustrated with them. At the same time, if they don't win sometimes, the players don't look at them as a credible threat. So the villain has to win in order to be a plotter. And honestly, like, even you can be as much of a planner of a DM as you want to be, but like, you are still one person against 3 or 4 players, and 3 or 4 people working together will come up with things that you did not foresee. But you can ask yourself really honestly, I didn't see that coming, but would this villain have seen that coming? Especially when the players say something. If you get the feeling when your players announce they want to do something, and you get this sinking feeling that goes, oh, that's obvious, that's when you have my permission to cheat. Like, that's like, if your immediate response to what the players propose is like, why did I not think, like, why didn't I think of that? Then your villain should have thought of it. Right? And you're okay to metagame the situation and give them some sort of out. But I kind of think that you kind of have to give them the rule of 3, and you have to also give the players a good opportunity to get a victory out of it, right? Like, they get something for having stumped you, right? Whether that is the villain has to leave behind treasure, or the villain has to expose an important secret, or the villain has to give up one of their minions, or the villain loses their stronghold, or something along those lines. If your players do pull one over on you, you can let the villain anticipate it, but still get defeated, but still like have that kind of thing. Or you can go on like the full gambits inside gambits and like the intricate plot, but it's hard to expect everything your players will do. It's almost impossible even. So sometimes you kind of just have to metagame a little bit with an intelligent villain, and that's okay.
Awesome. Dyson Doggos asks, what's the best way to combine 2 monsters? Like a vampire spawn and assassin. What's a good way to choose abilities to keep, to throw away, and adjust? I want to answer with the actual example given. The example given, if we're combining a vampire and an assassin, I would look at the abilities, and I would decide what abilities are vampire abilities and what abilities are combat abilities. When anything that makes the vampire a vampire, like keeping their I don't know, sunlight sensitivity, their bite attack, their ability to transform into a bat or a wolf, their ability to regenerate, those are all inherent I'm a vampire sort of things. When it comes to their attacks and all of that, I would replace those with the assassin, give them their sneak attack, the poison damage, and the additional abilities. And in this exact example, I think that there's a much clearer option here of saying, well, a vampire's vampire-y things are these, but an assassin's assassin things are actually completely separate. Where it gets harder is when you're combining 2 things that overlap in this weird way that isn't like a vampire assassin makes sense, but a vampire, well, actually a vampire dragon I was about to say, but that sounds really cool.
Actually, there have been some really cool vampire dragons and some
so I think where I'm going with that though is that there are challenges when you have 2 things that are both like would have inherent abilities, and then you kind of need to pick and choose.
My quick and dirty way of combining two monsters is go through the stat block, and whatever stat is better, the monster has whatever's better between the two of the stat blocks. So you just merge them together, unless it feels wildly inappropriate. Like as an example, like, you know, you might not give a stone giant mage. You might not, like, I don't know. There might be an ability score that you don't increase or something like that, depending on like what you're adding together. And then like you can literally just copy and paste and put together like element A, element B, and if you find two elements that are in conflict with one another, decide which one is more important. It's actually really easy to smash together two creatures' stat blocks. Where it gets the easiest one is when you take an NPC stat block and slam it onto a monster. So like another really easy example to do would, instead of the vampire dragon, if you wanted to have a spellcasting dragon, you could take the mage stat block and throw that onto an adult red dragon if you wanted to do that. And then just go through the stat block and see what's different. And really what you're going to find is that with the mage stat block, you're literally just taking the text of the mage spellcasting and putting that on the dragon stat block, and then adjust the DCs and everything appropriately for that. But then the big question is like, what challenge rating is it at the end? Usually when you do this, it actually might not change the challenge rating of the higher challenge rating monster. If it does, it might only change it by 1 or 2, because usually a monster's challenge rating is a factor not of how many different abilities they have, but what ability they have that does the most damage and how many hit points they have. So when you do smash two stat blocks together, ask yourself, can the monster actually do more damage than it could before? Does the monster actually have better defenses than it did before? Or does it just have more things it can do? If it has more things that it can do, but it doesn't actually do more damage and isn't actually any tougher to kill, it doesn't change its hit points, right? But if you did something like where like, you know, one example of where you can get caught up with that is like, if you do add spellcasting onto a dragon, and now that dragon can cast Wall of Fire, well, that actually does increase its damage output, right? A dragon that can cast Fireball, that actually doesn't increase its damage output a lot, because its breath weapon does way more damage than a Fireball anyways. But a dragon can cast a Wall of Fire and make its attacks and use its breath weapon, so you have to like figure out what combos have you enabled by doing this. And usually it only happens with spellcasting. When you add spellcasting to a monster.
This next question actually kind of, in my mind, links to the question about running intelligent NPCs. But George asks, to what extent should I give homebrew enemies the ability to counter my PC's abilities? Example, move without triggering opportunity attacks versus a player character with Sentinel. I think that something that's important to keep in mind is that for climactic battles, oftentimes we want to challenge the players more, but also we need enough battles that the player characters can use their cool abilities and use them well. So to what extent should you give these out? I would say only on the coolest of your prime encounters, not on any minions. Maybe let a few of the boss monsters even not have abilities that directly counter the PCs. Sometimes the players absolutely trashing a dragon in 3 rounds is going to be the highlight of their game. But then if that happens, the next time they face a big villain, you might want to make something that challenges them a bit more to show them the opposite side of things. But it's not something you want to do every time. Absolutely not, because as much fun as it is for a DM to challenge their players, it is just as much fun for the players to destroy a combat encounter. No bars, holding no bars, nuking the bad guy, using their coolest abilities, watching them work well, and walking away unscathed. It's a good feeling for them.
I will say the most enjoyable form of challenge in D&D is generally the challenge where you have to use your abilities in order to succeed. The most players don't like it when their abilities are directly countered and don't find it challenging, and they don't find it fun. They usually just find it frustrating. So for this reason, I think that you should directly counter a player's ability extremely sparingly. So your example of a character that can move without opportunity attacks versus Sentinel, I would not give that to a bunch of minions that the players are going to be fighting for several combat encounters or in entire adventure arcs. I would maybe give that to one specific villain as a recharge ability, right? Or of course, now there's actually a lot of ways to get around Sentinel, like teleportation. So those are more justified abilities, and in fact that's where I would also go to. If you want to play around a player's ability, find opportunities to use the justified counters. Like, yeah, a character can get away from a character that has Sentinel by teleporting away from them. That's a justified counter. That's fine. We all recognize that teleporting costs a spell slot or an ability or something like that. Like, it's a special thing. But like, if you just have a monster who innately says this monster ignores Sentinel, I would actually not ever do that. I would just not do it at all. Just by a similar token, like if you have like a monster that did, what would be a really weird like if you had a monster that was just flat out, and like you can get away with a few other things. Like sometimes a monster that is flat out immune to magic or immune to damage can be interesting. Like, because those are things that pose a problem to the entire party. But there's a difference between having a monster that cannot be hurt, because that is a problem that the whole party has to solve, versus I'm a character that has this cool thing, and now I don't get to play with my toys while the rest of the party gets to have fun. So be aware of that distinction when you're placing placing the threats in front of your players. If you're countering one specific player character's very specific ability or attribute, do that very sparingly. If you're presenting a puzzle or a problem for the entire party to solve, that's another matter entirely.
Awesome. Our next question is from Michael. When gods get involved directly with players in a campaign, what are ways to handle that in terms of both role-playing for the intimidation awe factor and mechanics of their power level?
I'm just going to start off by saying that generally speaking, the moment gods get directly involved in a campaign is usually the moment where I personally, as a player, check out. Because I find that Deus Ex Machina sucks. And as soon as the gods get involved, oftentimes many campaigns where the gods are involved will have some kind of really contrived rule that states that, like, the gods have some sort of neutrality pact or mutually assured destruction thing that says, like, the gods can only intervene in certain ways, like through mortal agents and stuff like that. And usually the campaign involves some sort of evil deity that is skirting these rules, and the bad guy can get around the rules, but the good gods can't. Like, that's usually the way that these sort of things play out, right? Would you say that that's usually the common trope, is that, like, the gods have limits, and it's not like it's some sort of like divine order that maybe is given down by like the overgod Ao that says, like, the gods cannot interfere except in these ways, but there's a bunch of loopholes. And I usually, like, as a player, I've usually found those unsatisfying explanations. So I tend to avoid this in general. But when you are role playing the god, but when the gods do get directly involved and they do show up, I find it's best to be sort of aloof and strange with gods. That the gods existed in a way that mortals just can't comprehend. Like they just, and so one of my favorite examples of this is, do you remember the Kevin Smith movie Dogma?
Yeah.
Do you remember Alan Rickman's character in that movie? I think he was called like the Metatron. And Alan Rickman was an angel that was literally the voice of God. Because in the world of Dogma, the angels and the divine host discovered that the actual voice of God made humans' heads explode. And so God had to send the Metatron to talk to mortals because God, like the essence of a divine being was just so incomprehensible. And like you can look at real world myth as well. Like for me, I also love the story of Moses and the burning bush, right? Like I love it when gods appear in ways that are just weird, right? Like they show up and they say things like, no one is more humble than me, and I am that I am. Like the gods are more intimidating and more awesome in my mind when they behave in an inscrutable way and where they're almost like eldritch horrors. Because really, like, the idea of a god is very like there's the Greek idea of the god, but there's still like this weird like eldritch terror to it, right? Like and when you make gods these bizarre and inscrutable beings, that being in their very presence is a mind-bending experience, that's for me when you start to get cooking with gas.
I'm thinking right now, a lot of what you said is actually very much on point with what I would have said. I run, if I do involve gods, they are basically eldritch horrors, and even if they're good intending eldritch horrors, they're still unfathomable and confusing to humans. And I'm thinking of this thing that's been floating around the internet recently, that is, an artist did a rendering of the actual description of biblical angels.
Yes.
And instead of them being people with wings, they turned into like, there was this
they're like abominations. They're horrifying. Yeah.
There's like one that's like a million eyeballs, and there's one that's like a giant eye with like rotating rings around it that's just like incomprehensible. And it's like when you think of these entities as completely like separate from the world, and them showing up in the world is like ants looking up to the human who is looking over their ant farm. Mm-hmm. And it's not like an ant understands when the human shows up and it's like, I am here to feed my ant farm, or I am here to see how they're doing and make things better. Like, they just see this giant, incomprehensible figure emerge and like place like a twig down and then disappear. And they're like, what is this twig? Yeah. Does it mean something? Are we supposed to interact with it? Like, there's a lot of people take the ant metaphor as like thinking like the god will just show up and they'll understand the god, and the god will be like, I can crush you because you're ants. But that's not really the ant metaphor. An ant metaphor would not understand the boot that's coming down towards it, or the face looking at it.
The other thing that's another cool inspiration for God is like gods often work through signs and portents, right? Like they send bizarre messages, they send dreams, they send visions. And so I do think that the less directly hands-on your gods are, the better they probably are, and the more fantastical it makes them. Like as soon as your god, like for me, where it really loses the most for me is like when the god shows up and they're like a dude, and they're basically just a really powerful NPC that will beat you up if you don't do what they say. That's the thing to avoid. That's the number one thing to avoid. Like if they just show up and they look like a regular human that's glowing with like obviously like, you know, the rays of sunlight around them, and they act like a really obstinate entitled Karen of an NPC. Like I hate that term, but like it kind of like that's the sort of like way that I would avoid with a god. And from there I think it depends on what you want to do with them, right? Like how they're involved in the plot, what they exist to do, what the limitations are. It's a really big question, but for me, go mysterious, go Eldritch Terror, and you don't need to worry about them having stats, right? Like a god, a god just exists on another level. Like I wouldn't even have a god insulted by being attacked. Like a god doesn't get upset when the player characters throw a punch at them. A god doesn't get upset when the player characters insult them, because a mortal is no threat to a deity. And so unless your god wants to be that prideful kind of arrogant sort of thing, but I find that's a trope that is a little tired and worth avoiding.
I'm going to actually go down to one of our character building questions here.
Yeah.
For the next one. Do you oppose against type or non-optimized builds when creating characters? This was an interesting question because at first my answer was just a flat out no. But I actually thought a little harder about this, so I wanted to give an answer. So you'll notice that on our channel, Monty and I talk a lot about optimization. We always talk about like, what's the best this, what are the coolest this, what are the strongest options. And that's kind of what we do in our channel. But if you ever watch our live play, I like to make characters that are more role play heavy than they are necessarily optimized.
Mm-hmm.
But I think where the difference is, there's a line here. An against type or non-optimized build, everybody should be encouraged to do that if the roleplay seems fun for you. What you shouldn't do is make a character that is useless in too many places, weak at everything, and can't contribute to a teamwork-oriented game and offer value to the party in meaningful ways.
Mm-hmm.
If you create a wizard with an intelligence of -4, like their intelligence modifier is -4, and they're bumbling around pretending that they can cast spells, and you're like, I made a cool against type character. He's really, really dumb and doesn't understand how to cast spells. What you're actually doing is you're playing something that's going to hinder the other people at the table who want to actually, win a combat encounter, and then you can't cast a single spell because all of them fail because your saving throw is awful. There is a way to build a character, and actually, I'm gonna throw it to the one character I played in an Untold Tales, Chud, the halfling.
Yeah.
I structured him as a competent build. He was a decently built ranger who could perform in combat. What I did is I role-played it that it was all an accident. He would trip, fall, and his sword would go through the enemy in front of him. But I would roll my attacks as normal. I would do the appropriate amount of damage, and I would still participate. So you don't need to be optimized. That's not what I'm saying. But you need to probably not be a detriment to the party, and don't purposely make your most important stat your dump stat, or purposely build your character in a way that makes them incredibly flawed to the point where they just can't help. What you can do is play non-optimized and role play it so that it fits the theme you're looking for. And if you kind of meet in the middle of I really want to play a character who's a bumbling idiot, then you can still make their intelligence, let's say we're playing an idiot spellcaster, make their intelligence high enough that they have a decent score to cast spells. But you can role play that they're only book smart and everything they know is read out of a book, but they suck at social encounters. They don't know anything about the world, and they are just kind of bumbling through situations. But boy, do they know how to cast a fireball because they've read that book a million times. So there are ways to do that.
I am going to say that, okay, I don't oppose it either at all. I think that there's a point where, like, let's be honest with ourselves about, like, what's actually going on here, right? Like, as a really good example, like, let's just say that I want to make a wizard that has a high strength score and tries to use a greatsword, and I'm going to take the weapon master feat, and I'm going to take great weapon master, and I'm going to try to play a greatsword wielding wizard because that's what I want to be. Well, I mean, yes, but there's a lot of ways that you could have a character that uses magic and uses a greatsword, and that synergizes together really nicely, and it doesn't even have to be optimized. So is the objective to be, like, deliberately ineffective? Because if the objective is to be deliberately ineffective, then I'm like, what's going on here? Because I feel like with reflavoring, with retcon, with like the power of reflavoring, you can make almost any concept work. And even if you have a concept that is quote unquote against type, you can reflavor the mechanics in such a way that those things gel, right? So, you know, if we want to imagine a wizard that uses a greatsword, if that's your concept from the very beginning, I as a DM would be totally fine if you wanted to realize that concept either by being an Eldritch Knight or a Blade Singer or any other variety of options, right? So I think that there's a couple different ways to do that. I do, like, ultimately, if it's going to be the most enjoyable thing for you and your group is going to enjoy it, like, go ahead, please play the character. Like, play the character that you want to play. We did a whole video about it. Like, play the character that you want to play. It's really important that you do. You have to enjoy that. And I will say, like, if you get a laugh, if for you the most enjoyable thing about it is, like, being this, you know, Bob the greatsword wielding wizard who goes in every combat, tries to use great weapon master, never hits a single thing, never casts an actual spell, and you play an entire campaign that way and have an epic story to tell about it, power to you. Like, awesome. I'm proud of you. I don't know if I would enjoy that personally. I don't know if I would necessarily even enjoy playing in a campaign with a person that was doing that. But I think that it's, but I support, like, you and your group doing that. Like, I think that's the critical thing. Like, we all have our tastes, and we're allowed to have tastes, and people have fun in different ways. This is why session 0 is so important. Right?
Yeah.
Like we shouldn't get, like, it's fine for us to acknowledge that we don't personally have an interest in playing the game a certain way. Just like I can say, I don't want any pineapple anywhere near my pizza, and please never do that to me. If you want to order a separate pizza for yourself so you can have pineapple on your pizza, I will put the order in. But I am not having any of that pineapple anywhere near any of the pizzas that I'm eating.
I love pineapple on pizza.
Well, then this is why there's, like, 2-for-1 deals. Right. and I think that the secret of the 2-for-1 deal is, in the role-playing game world, the buy 2 pizzas get 1 free is not playing Dungeons and Dragons and looking at games that aren't D&D that handle these different play styles a little bit better than D&D does. Right.
Yeah. I can think of, like, yeah, there's so many examples of people who wanted to play off-type characters, but they still were, like, our friend Mike wanted to play a wizard or a sorcerer who came from a long line of fighters, and he thought he was a great fighter, but what happened is his spells were so uncontrollable that he did have a sword, and he would run in, and he was so afraid of being in combat that he would close his eyes and just start swinging his sword. And when he would open his eyes again, people would be dead. And he was like, what was actually happening is he would run in, start swinging his sword, and spells would come out of him. As he yelled and flailed around. He never actually played this character, but when he was like telling me about the concept, I'm like, so the fact is you're still building a sorcerer who's a spellcaster. You're just going to roleplay that you're running and pretending you're a warrior, and it's working somehow. So there's a lot of fun ways to do that.
And I would just say that, like, at the end of the day, I feel like you could come to me with any like against type concept, and we could probably optimize it. Right? Like, that's the beautiful thing about optimization, is that it's not always about what is the most powerful thing that we can make. Sometimes it's about making your concept work in a way that is fun, playable, enjoyable, and effective. Right?
And that is really, I think, what the goal of our channel is. When it comes to optimization, I always go role-playing first when I'm building a character. But then Monty and I sit down and discuss, okay, I've got this great role-play idea. How do we make it work the best? Yeah. And sometimes it's not picking the greatest of everything. It's picking what's right to make this character come to life.
Yeah, and it just, oftentimes it just greases the wheels of the whole interaction, right? Like, if you want to play a fighter, like if you want to play a wizard with a greatsword, taking a single level of fighter can go a long way to making that concept actually work, right? So
cool. The next question here is from Voodoo's. Hey dudes. Hi. I've built a campaign set in a desert built around tomb raiding. I plan on using an adult blue dragon as the BBEG, but want to know how I bring them to the party's knowledge without them going straight to the lair and getting killed. The campaign looks like it's levels 3 to 15.
The dragon flies through the sky, like, all the time. Players in the whole regions, like people in the region, see the dragon flying through the sky. There are tales and stories of the adult blue dragon that dwells in the desert and preys on the caravans that have to make the trek through the long desert. And every caravaner knows that you need to bring 50 camels extra to offer as tribute to the dragon if you want to make safe passage through the desert.
That's a great one. I was going a completely different direction with my thoughts, so this is actually great. So not only that one seems obvious, the dragon's just around, people know about it. For me, blue dragons specifically feel like the most likely dragon to be a spellcaster and be intelligent.
Yeah.
So giving the blue dragon some spells that include, is it astral projection? There's like a projection. What's the spell that lets you project image? Yeah. So you give the blue dragon project image or sending or scrying or like telepathic ways that they can appear without appearing, telepathically communicate or torment. Give them dream. Yeah. Have them torment the players in their dreams. I think that there's a lot of great spells that we can equip any major villain with that allows them to show up. Or you can just steal what Monty did in one of our campaigns. Isn't really a spell, but he just had, there were statues of the main villain all throughout the world. And whenever we found one of these statues, the main villain could kind of enter the statue and talk to us. Yeah. And we couldn't do anything. We could smash the statue, but then we just weren't talking to him. He was fine. Yeah. So using tactics like this allow you to torment the party, which does get them riled up to fight the main villain, which I actually think is important to introduce your villain before the end of your campaign. But there are definitely spells and tools that you can use to make that more likely.
Yeah, and you also have to make the Dragon's Lair a legendary place that is told about in local legends. And for me, I think the Dragon's Lair is surrounded by a permanent sandstorm. And so those who try to even approach the Dragon's Lair know that past the maze of dunes lies the sand wall. and the sand wall now hovers over the city of the pharaohs, or whatever term you want to, the Pasha's palace. And like, there is an old ancient city that is buried under the desert sands, and like maybe there's a sultan's palace, or anything like that, like, the kingly palace that the dragon is. Or like, you could draw inspiration from Petra, right? The ruins of Petra, and or like any sort of ancient cities. And yeah, like this is there in the desert. People know it exists. People even could tell you what direction it is. It's just definitely suicide to go there. And maybe there's a legend that states that, like, what was it in only you can even have a prophecy or some sort of riddle that says that, like, only a person who is bearing, the light of truth can find their way through the desert storms, or something like that. And like,
a diamond in the rough.
Yes, a diamond in the rough. And like, that's actually, and like, the truth of that is that that's actually like a magical artifact that allows you to, like, or you need to, or like, only there's these ancient desert dwelling people who have like an order of druids, and they're super secretive, and maybe you can find them and they will help you find the way. Or, maybe you can go straight out of Dune and you've got purple worms and sandworms that dwell in the desert, and the only way through the sandstorm is to tame a purple worm and ride it through the
Oh man, this is so cool.
Yeah,
I want to play this campaign now.
Yeah, so there you go. And then like, the dragon, like, and one of the ways to role play the interactions, right, is the dragon knows every inch of the desert. Like, the dragon knows who lives there. All the people know the dragon, and maybe the dragon says, like, one day the dragon encounters the players and says, "Oh, you must be new here. I am," what we need a blue dragon name. "I am Azure Mist, the desert wind, and this is my lands. You are new here, so I will grant you one. I will grant you amnesty this one time, but next time you better have 5 camels." And the dragon can just demand tribute and just say that, and that can be the way that it works. And like, the dragon, again, you can take that out of the book of from gods. The dragon's not interested in actually fighting. The dragon just wants, like, camels and gold, because it's hungry and thirsty and likes treasure, and have it be a presence, right? And yes, of course, the dragon has a plan. But, like, everyone's got to eat, right? Like,
I like that the camel satisfied both hunger and thirst, because now I'm imagining the dragon poking a straw into the camel hump and drinking the water. But, that's in my campaign. My blue dragon treats camels like juice boxes.
Yeah.
Also, my blue dragon's name is Lightning McQueen. Thank you very much. It's not a good name. All right. Anyway, moving on. My bad jokes are over. EO asks, one of my PCs, a moon druid, was just bitten by a werewolf and lost the save. I think it has a lot of potential for the story, but what are the best mechanics for it? Do you have any tips about the immunities and losing control against the curse?
Grim Hollow transformations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Grim Hollow actually
yeah.
did offer a great section on monstrous transformations.
Yeah.
I think I'm using that term because that's in our book, but transforming into a vampire, transforming into a werewolf. They actually have a lot of rules in place for that. If you don't want to buy a whole book, I feel like
I feel like if you don't want to buy a whole book, the easiest way to run the werewolf, the damage immunities are really hard to navigate around. And I think that I think that with the werewolf, you might want to. There's an opportunity here to say that like the curse affects this character differently because they're a druid and they can already shapeshift. And one of the cool ways that you could actually resolve this is that the druid's ability as a shapeshifter gives them the ability to assume their wolf form and treat it like a wild shape, like treat it like a special wild shape that they can turn into a werewolf. And it's like, here's the werewolf stat block, here you go, right? You can turn into the werewolf using the whole werewolf spell stat block, but that is a use of your wild shape to do that, right? Willingly. If you transform otherwise, you lose control. And then maybe in that case, and only when they're transformed in the werewolf form do they have the damage resistance. I would maybe not give them that damage immunity. Yeah, that's pretty powerful. And the losing control thing could actually be that every time they do transform of their own volition, you could just have them at the end of the night, they have to roll a d6, and if they roll under the number of times that they transformed, they go on a rampage.
I also think like they can transform on that like by their own volition, but also maybe on full moon nights they have to roll a dice. They're gonna transform, and they have to roll a wisdom saving throw or a charisma saving throw to see if they can hold on to their personality during this unexpected well, not unexpected because you probably know when the full moon's coming, but if you are a moon druid, that also implies that the moon's kind of your thing. Maybe you can even cast moonbeam, and I don't know where I'm going with that, but yeah, transforming into a werewolf, I think that the druid might be able to control it a little bit more, but maybe they have to make a charisma saving throw to determine on certain transformations if they can maintain control or not. And if they can't, they still get to take their turns, but you could put them under the effects of like they need to, like almost like a barbarian in Rage, where like they need to attack something every turn. If they don't, I would even take it a step further and like they receive damage or like psychic damage if they don't attack something every turn. So they turn into a werewolf, you sick them on the bad guys, now all the bad guys are done, and the party needs to like tie them up until the sun rises or something. And it's a problem that needs to be solved. So there's some cool role-playing aspects that you could put in there, but also make sure that the player likes those ideas.
Yeah.
Discuss them with the player. Mm-hmm. I, as a player, would love role-playing that, but some people might be like, oh, so I kind of might lose control of my player. And like, there are people that I think wouldn't be as much of a fan as I would be of letting go of my player because I'm a werewolf and it sounds cool.
Yeah. I like that. Charlie asks, I'm starting to build a homebrew campaign, but being a newer DM, I'm thinking of using pre-made modules for locations and creating the plot hooks and encounters myself. Any advice on this? Thanks, dudes. Charlie, I gotta say, I did this as a new DM as well. I've done this for years. This is an absolutely amazing technique to use in building your campaigns. Steal whenever there's some material that has been made by someone else that you can use or co-opt or steal for your game. You absolutely should. I do this with maps and locations quite prominently, and I think the biggest thing is to just not fall down the Google search hole. I would like whenever you need a map for something, I guarantee you someone has made a map of that location in some way, shape, or form, unless you have something extremely specific in mind. My tip for this would be follow the map maker patrons, Patreons. There's really awesome map makers like Dice and Logos, 2 Minute Tabletop, Neutral Party, Venatus Maps is another one that I really love their cartography. Even like official mappers like Mike Schley. Checking out all their work and just starting to build an archive of your map file, right? And sometimes it's where like I have a folder on my hard drive called Maps, and I used to have it much better categorized than I do now. But it used to be like it used to be that like I had like wilderness maps, urban maps, dungeon maps, and that's like a good categorization to start with. And then those maps that are made that are full color that you can put into a VTT or print out or rebuild, you can use them for whatever you want. And sometimes, especially I've had this happen now that we played online. If you have a hard drive filled with maps that you've downloaded that are already categorized, and you're playing on a virtual tabletop and your players go somewhere that you hadn't prepared for, well, you can just immediately ask for a 5-minute break, upload the map, and you're off to the races.
I've talked about my home campaign several times. I'm running a home campaign right now that is doing exactly this. I read through, why am I forgetting the name of it? Dragon Heist, Waterdeep Dragon Heist, and Tales from the Yawning Portal. And I took my favorite pieces out of both of them, and I'm running a campaign that we're calling Waterdeep Tavern Tycoon. And in it, the party has their own tavern in Waterdeep, and they're trying to compete with the Yawning Portal. In doing so, they're going on a bunch of quests both around the city and outside of it to try to find assets that make their tavern better. For example, I changed the lore a little bit and I ran the Sunless Citadel, but the quest was to find these ancient fruits so that they could use them to make a new magical cider with healing properties because it would be a selling point for their tavern. So they're going around Waterdeep. Manshoon is involved. Jarlaxle's involved. The Xanathar's involved. The Castellanters are involved. Like all of these personalities from Dragon Heist are there, and they're interfering with the plans. So that's one of the plot lines. But then also, I get to use the Yawning Portal as outside adventure sites, and I'm twisting them so that there's stuff there for them to use. So I do this all the time.
I would just say my only like things to watch out for with doing this is, first of all, like, don't get too obsessed with building a massive collection of stuff that you might never use. Like, make sure that you're still focusing on things that you actually see using in the immediate future, because definitely, like, obviously it's fun. Like, I'll just say that I enjoy spending my spare time looking at modules and finding stuff and like being like, oh, this is a cool map, this is a cool thing, I might use this in one way one day. But like, I have more maps than my map hard drive than I will ever use. Ever. Right? And then because the downfall of it, have you ever had that thing where like you open the fridge and the fridge is filled with tons of food and you don't want any of it, and then you end up and then you end up ordering sushi or pizza or sushi pizza. So weird. Actually, you know what is not weird? Sushi burritos. That's where
I want to try one.
Man, you know, I realized we had that debate about like burritos and stuff like that. But I will concede that a sushi burrito is an apex form of a burrito. Like that is definitely. Oh man,
I don't know if it's that. I mean, you're talking about my favorite food here. I love burritos, but a sushi burrito might be the apex form of sushi. I don't even know about that, but I want to try one.
A sushi burrito is basically just a roll that hasn't been cut up, but they're delicious.
I've never had one, but off topic. Let's go back down to the character building questions. There's a couple here that I think are pretty awesome.
Cool.
How do this one is from Marika the Dane. How do I successfully play a multi-class character? I like the rogue. I want to mix it with something that will give me a badass archer. Please help a noob out. I have a very easy rule of thumb for this. When you are planning to multi-class, if you want to make sure you are safe with your multi-class, make sure that the two characters, the two classes that you are going to be using have at least the same, have either the same prime ability or the second choice The second choice is prime ability is the secondary ability. That's as far as I would go. You don't want to necessarily multi-class a wizard and a druid.
Yeah.
If one of them is going to be using intelligence for spellcasting, one of them is going to be using for wisdom for spellcasting. Both of them want a high constitution. You probably want a good dexterity, and that's where it starts to get complicated. Yeah. Unless you're rolling for stats and you suck and rolled 18 in everything and are one of those players, then by all means you can multi-class whatever the heck you want, I guess. But when you're playing a rogue and you're an archer, picking up a few levels of fighter who can also be a dexterity-based class can go a long way. Or even like a rogue monk, because monks can invest in dexterity, although they mostly are going to be, well, dexterity and wisdom. So there's a play there. But look, since you're an archer rogue, look for other classes that are going to excel at what you're already good at, so that you can double down on those.
I will say, if you're playing the rogue, a great pairing is the rogue and the ranger. I personally think the best way to do the ranger and the rogue is to take 5 levels of ranger and then go rogue from there. And this is where my central piece of like advice is that often with multi-classing, it's better to take 1, 3, or 5 levels of a class and then go to switch to another class and stay there for there. The thing that never works with multi-classing is I start as a level 1 rogue and then gain 1 level of ranger. Then I'm level 2 rogue, level 2 ranger, and don't seesaw back and forth as you level up. Stick with one class for a couple levels and then pick up a couple levels of the other class. And then once you've kind of got the key, like somewhere around level 10 is where you can kind of decide what is the one that you're going to take the further of the two.
Yeah, I don't know how I missed Ranger Rogue. That's iconic. So yeah, pairing a rogue with Ranger, Fighter, Monk. Are there any other good choices? I see somebody mention Hexblade. Hexblade could be cool with a rogue. You do kind of, if your rogue was a swashbuckler and you had high charisma, then going Hexblade, there is a benefit there. I can totally see. Yep. What you don't want is if you dumped charisma on your rogue, going Hexblade actually doesn't do you a lot of favors. So it is all about where your stats are lined up. And that I think is the most important part.
Yeah, Lord Samael wants to know, I'm playing a Mastermind Rogue in an upcoming campaign. Idea that he's an aspiring crime lord, working on his way to outmaneuver his dad for the throne. How would you roleplay the Mastermind's Master of Tricks feature? This is the feature that allows them to do the help action even when someone is 30 feet away. For this character, I think that I would rule that their help action is kind of like that, like always prepared sort of thing, right? Like the help action is them saying, like, you know how like in some action movies, like the characters will be like fighting an enemy and then it'll look like the enemy's got the upper hand, and then one of the characters is like, remember what we practiced now, right? And they do that cool unexpected move that turns the whole fight around, right? So I would imagine it being kind of like your rogue has like talked with your party about like tricks and stuff like that, and has plotted out a bunch of things, and it's like, this is the moment, strike, or something like that. Like a sort of, you could kind of imagine them as like maybe even the tactician or the party lead, like the tactical leader of the party as well, and they're actually saying battle commands and tactics, or even offering inspiring words, or even just acting like a mercenary and say like, rub some dirt in it, get them, right? So there's all sorts of ways that you could role play that. What about you, Kelly?
Similar vein, but I imagine that like during your long rests, the Mastermind Rogue has a playbook like almost like a football coach has a playbook, but they have a playbook of like battle tactics, and they're sitting down with the party with their book during long rests, being like, all right, have you thought about this move with your sword? Like if an enemy is coming at you like this, if you do these maneuvers, you can hit them in the weakest spot with minimal effort.
Yeah.
And they're like talking to everybody about that. Then on the battlefield, they're like, Bill the fighter, do the thing. And it's just like Bill the fighter is like, oh, the thing that we talked about. And yeah, you're Captain America. You're like, you're going to be doing this. You're going to be doing this. And like you're yelling it out during the battle. You're like, Tony, I need you in the air. And then Iron Man takes to the air and beats up the bad guys there. So what you don't want to do, though, the careful balance here is you can role play that, but you're also kind of greasing it a little with the fact that you're still going to let the player do what they want to do. You're not going to be like, use your action surge. And they're like, I don't want to use my action surge. But you just imagine it like you're like, do the thing that we talked about. And you can yell out something random. And then that player's like, cool, now I'm going to get advantage on my attack. Thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say build it into the role play of your downtime. Have a playbook. You're the mastermind. You're the tactician. You know where the weak spot on every enemy is. And you are observing the battlefield very keenly and can see what your party's doing and know what they're about to do next and know when the right time to hit hard is.
Yeah, I think also we got a couple more patron questions, but chat, if you want to start sending us your questions, we'll start collecting them to get those for you as well. We might not be able to answer every single question that gets asked, but go ahead and start. We'll be able to start grabbing those from y'all now.
This last question here that we have for role playing is from Brittany Anderson. I currently play a tiefling knowledge cleric wizard of Saloon who has a reoccurring dream of being consumed by shadows. I also gave up her dark vision. Do you have any advice, ideas for role playing phobias and overcoming them? Really cool concept here. I think that with phobias, working with flaws can be super interesting. And I do think that flaws are actually a really important part of the role play of your character because it's kind of fun to not just win all the time. And I think that as long as you're not disrupting play at the table, again, that's the most important thing. You want to make sure that everybody's having a good time. But making a detriment for yourself in a moment where your phobia comes up is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm gonna give an example. There was a scene in one of our first campaigns that Monty ever ran for me. My wizard was terrified of spiders. And there was a scene where we were like in a field, we open up a barn and it's full of spiders, but I think it was illusionary spiders. And they started crawling all over me. And so my wizard cast it, like I had written on my character sheet, terrified of spiders. I wanted to roleplay this. It was his phobia. On my turn, I ran out of the barn and cast Burning Hands on myself. And then rolled around in the field for a while. It impacted the battle. The other party members had to now navigate that situation. They just left me. But, you know, I wasn't, for that turn, I wasn't really contributing to battle. But everybody had a good time with it because it was really fun. It was really funny. And it was a great scene of my character dealing with that. Towards the end of the campaign, I'm pretty sure that what started to happen is my character turned that around, and I started casting Burning Hands at big spiders and defeating them. So it turns into like you turn that phobia into power slowly. At first, bless you. At first, maybe making a few funny scenes and then, you know, building on that as well, and starting to see the change slowly and gradually. Like, you can even roleplay your character after you make the detrimental move. The next time you roleplay your character being terrified but dealing with it, and then a few times later they just deal with it, and now they're better. Now they're working on it.
I have no notes. Masterful advice.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Cast
burning hands on yourself. That's the answer.
Yeah.
All right. Questions from chat. Monty, what do we got?
LK Noodles asks, how would you balance combat in parties for a party of just 2 PCs? I DM for my 2 friends and have some trouble finding that sweet spot for difficulty. 2 is hard. It is really, really hard. I think with 2 PCs, I would focus on using single enemies more often than not, rather than groups of foes. And you really also have to remember that with 2-player characters, it is a crisis if one of them goes down. So you have to adjust your expectations of the difficulty of your campaign, in that your campaign might only have a couple moments where one of the 2 characters is reduced to 0 hit points, and that will be some of the scariest moments in the campaign, and that will mean that something went very, very wrong. So if you're like, oh, I never reduced them to 0 hit points, that's fine. There's only 2 of them. That means that you just took out half the party when someone goes to 0. You know what I mean? So don't worry that you're not challenging your PCs because you haven't reduced them to 0 hit points.
David asks, how do you know if you are overstuffing a campaign? I'm worried I have too many plot lines, locations, villains, etc. I feel like you need to pay attention to your players to be the judge of that. If they're fine following everything that you're throwing out there, then you're good. But as soon as the character or the players are forgetting quest lines, they're not going in the right direction, they're confused on what to do next. I actually remember, I think it was Dragon Age 3 actually, where I picked up so many plot, like, side quests that I actually was like, oh man, I don't even know what any of the, like, I got lost and confused. I actually had to take a break and I restarted Dragon Age 3 and just did the main story because the side quests were getting like too cumbersome for me. And I think, like, as a player, if I reach the point where I'm like, oh boy, I can't keep track of this all, then if your players are starting to wane, that's when you're overstuffing, and that's where you probably need to take a few plot lines and quickly wrap them up.
Yeah, and if your players are like, I don't remember who this person is or why we're working for them, that's a sign that probably just cut it. Like, it does suck, but kill your darlings. Like, sometimes you just have to cut it and just I also like to say, like, practice economy of NPCs. Like, are there opportunities where you can have 2 NPCs who are actually the same person?
Question from Lou. Do you wish you had one more PC for Dungeons of Drakenheim? And what class would you add to it?
Absolutely not.
Yeah, I'll answer both of those. I don't want another PC.
No.
I think that for the purposes of a streamed game, having 3 PCs allows each of us to have the spotlight for a really good amount of time. We can feed off of each other so well. And I actually like that there's more of a challenge this way. A lot of people are like, you guys need a healer. You know how dramatic it feels when one of us goes down? And, like, yeah, I kind of wish Wilhelm didn't go down all the time, but it always makes entertaining streaming.
I have to say, there is a reason why in so many stories there are 3 characters. There's something about the rule of 3 that is just, like, and you can nest it, but, like, Ron, Hermione, and Harry. Frodo, Sam, Gollum. Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli. Right? It always is, like, 3. Right.
Kirk, Spock, Bones.
Yeah, or even in the Avengers, like people had the big three of Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor, right? Like they were kind of like the even within that, right? But like also, I think that there's a ton of other like there's just so many examples in fiction where particularly television series where there is a triangle of three principal characters that are the focal point, and because it's really graspable and the dynamic between three is quite interesting. So I think for us as a stream game, like we originally were thinking about having a fourth person, and it didn't work out. Like we couldn't really figure out who it was going to be. And I think it was the best thing that we ever, the best decision we ever could have possibly made. It really, really would. I would sooner, like, I would not add another character to Drakenheim. No.
I think with the rule of three characters, I'm probably going to get this a little bit wrong with my terminology, but like, there's something about the central character is supposed to be the most malleable, where the other two side characters are the id and the ego.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be something like you have logic, you have
yes,
logic, passion.
It's logos, ethos, pathos. So you have logic, empathy, and the like morality, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or ethic. Yeah.
And we kind of try to do that. It kind of just happens itself. Like it happens in all of those forums. I think we kind of maybe do that in Drakenheim. It's interesting, but we don't go in with the plan to play those three pillars. But that's the way that the three pillars usually fall.
I think a fourth. I think the dynamic would really not, and also there are four people. Like it's four people in a DM, and like we have the nice. I love with our stream games, like we have the 4x4, the 2x2. Sorry, so yeah, right.
Yeah.
What 2 cantrips do you recommend for an Arcana domain cleric? Guidance. For sure, but you're probably going to take that anyways. Probably Minor Illusion and Mage Hand.
Minor Illusion and Mage Hand are my go-to cantrips. If I can get them on any character, then yeah, I do. Yeah. I have nothing else to add to that. The answer is Minor Illusion and Mage Hand.
What classes would I ask brand new players avoid? Druid comes to mind because of all the bookkeeping. Anything else? Okay, caveat. Some new players, it's more important that a new player live the fantasy of their first character and like they'll adapt. That having said, Kelly, what do you think new players should avoid?
So this is actually funny. I was going to say the exact same thing, and here's where this comes in. I think that warlocks are a tough sell for a brand new player.
Everyone thinks warlocks are great for new players. Warlocks suck for new players. They are terrible.
However,
they're absolutely not a good pick for new players.
My partner wanted to play a warlock as her first player character. She did. Mm-hmm. I did make a lot of adjustments though. I gave her her spell list as just known spells. I let her change her spells every time she actually between sessions because she was still learning what spells were good for her. I gave her a magic item that gave her like 3 extra spell slots. So really I very much finessed it so that she was having a lot more fun. But as it was written, I think it was it would have not been the greatest time, because keep in mind that a brand new player, especially as a spellcaster, actually benefits more from a spellcaster who can lose spells, pick different spells, have a lot of spells. Yeah. Clerics are actually great.
The clerics are amazing. Like for a new player who is interested in spellcasting and wants to learn how spellcasting works, clerics are perfect. Wizards are actually not that bad either.
Wizards, I did find, so my very first character was a wizard. It took me a while to wrap my head around how the spell book was working. That's my only thing. It is probably much easier to figure out than I was giving it credit for, and I think I just didn't even read it. Monty just was like, I built your character sheet for you because this is your first time ever sitting down. And then I kind of just didn't bother to look into it, and so I was kind of confused. But once, like after a few weeks, I was like, okay, I get it. Every time I level up, I'm gaining this many spells. I can learn new spells from here, here, and here. But once you kind of wrap your head around the spell book, wizards are pretty great. But the thing with new players, especially with spells, is that they don't know what spells do, and you have to learn what feels right. You can read the description of spells all day, but until you cast a spell, you don't know if you love it or hate it. I didn't know I hated Cure Wounds until I cast it. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. I knew that I didn't think it was the greatest spell, but then I've only ever cast it once in my entire career, and I was like, oh, well, that was pointless. And now I would take Healing Word over Cure Wounds 1,000% all the time. But I think, you know, I don't think that any of the martial classes are really a no-no for me for new players. I think there are ones that are better for new players. I think if you go like really the classic D&D party is your fighter, your wizard, your cleric, your rogue.
Yeah, and I do have to say I think the dynamic is really different if you had like a new player who plays video games or who has experience with board games already and or just is already a gamer is a very different new player than a new player that does not play games at all. And so it's a very different distinction because like when you introduce D&D to somebody who's played a lot of video game RPGs, it's pretty easy. Like they pick it up really, really fast, especially if they play games with character building. Like it's not that hard in terms of the principles embodied. I think the bigger challenge with the new player problem is when you introduce a new player of someone who plays board games casually and doesn't play video games, that's where it's hard. Because really what it is with the new player, the challenge is that someone who's played a lot of games has there's this really interesting idea that like video games have a vocabulary, right? And for example, a lot of video games now will not tell you what a health bar is at any point. They will just assume you know that is a health bar. Video games will use the term HP for hit points, and they will never tell you that HP stands for hit points, and that tells you how much life you have, and if this is reduced to 0, you die. They just don't tell you that. They assume you know how to read a video game. And so someone that doesn't know how to read games is in for a transition period. So I actually wonder if one of the best ways to get someone into D&D is to get them playing video games so that they get the vocabulary for how games work. Because I think you can learn the vocabulary of how games work faster from a video game than you can through D&D. It's just a bit of a tangent there, but yeah, you know what I mean? Like,
I think if you've played a ton of Skyrim, you're going to be okay in D&D.
Yeah.
There's a question here that I actually really like, and I want to talk about this, so I'm gonna answer it now. The question from Gabriel Oliveira. Do you guys think DMing a one-shot for a single person is okay as a way to introduce them to the game? I don't think you need to worry. If you're introducing a new player to the game, there's actually something that Monty did for me, and then I did for every person I introduced into the game. And Monty, I don't even know if you remember this. It's the orcish pie. Do you remember the orcish pie?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So here's the play. It's not necessarily a one-shot that requires any sort of storytelling or planning or character building. If you're introducing somebody to D&D for the very first time and they've never played a role-playing game, Monty asked me what character I wanted to play.
he gave me a pre-built level 1 or maybe level 3 character sheet of the character that I was hoping to play. And he presented me with a hallway, a door, a room. In that room were 2 orcs and a table with a pie on it. My goal was to obtain the pie. Some players might talk to the orcs. Some might fight the orcs. Some might try to sneak past the orcs. Either way, they're going to engage with the environment. Maybe they're going to do all 3. They're going to try to sneak past the orcs, fail, try talking to them, fail, and then have a combat encounter. To expand on that, one of our friends, Josh, actually ran probably one of the coolest one-shots I had ever seen, and I was really impressed because he had never DM'd before. He was just like, "Hey guys, come on over. I'm going to run a one-shot. It's my first time DMing." And we were like brand new adventurers in his little one-shot, and we showed up to this sort of like game show. And he was like, "You're here in this game show to accumulate points. You have 3 challenges, and whoever accumulates the most points wins the game show." And room 1, you had to solve a social puzzle. You had to talk your way through a social puzzle. Room 2 was like an exploration, find the clues, piece them together. And room 3 was defeat a bunch of living dummies that were walking towards you and you had to defeat them. And it wasn't until after we played it that like everybody came up with creative solutions to the problems. One of them, like, I forget how we got there, but one of the players like ended up on a table eating food off of a plate because part of the challenge was like to eat as much as possible. I don't know. There was like a bunch of wacky things, but somehow it involved excellent role playing from the whole team, excellent exploration, and excellent combat. And even though we were all experienced players, we had a blast with it. And afterwards, I think I told him, I'm like, this is one of the greatest one-shots to show a brand new group of players because in a very lighthearted and friendly way that isn't threatening to their characters, we had to engage with all the pillars of the game. So do something like that. Absolutely. Now, we did it with a group, but the Orcish Pie was something that Monty just ran for me, and I just ran that for my friends. And you could easily implement a way to make that one little social encounter, one little exploration, one little combat encounter, get them used to the mechanics and the 3 pillars of play.
Yeah, I think that I also think, just to offer a counterpoint, I think that when you are introducing a new player to D&D, get them to commit to 2 game sessions and run a 2-shot. Because I think that will more, first of all, it more naturally conveys the flow of D&D. Because the fact that D&D is played continuously session to session is really important. It also allows you to adjust halfway through if you need to change what's happened to fix around like where the story has gone, right? It gives you that time to respond between the 2 sessions. And it also just lets the game happen at a more relaxed pace and allows the player to be less overwhelmed. And when I say do it over 2 sessions, I say the thing that you think you're going to do in 1 session, plan for it to happen over 2. So I'm not saying make more content. Don't prepare anything more that you would have made for a one-shot. Same amount of material, just give yourself 2 sessions to get through it. And that way you can take a measured pace. You can let the player, because one of the things that a new player needs to take time to learn, even if they've played video games, is the core gameplay loop of D&D, of a role-playing game. That core gameplay loop is the dungeon master describes the environment. The player characters listen and then respond by describing their actions. And then the dungeon master narrates the results, rolling the dice when it's necessary to do so, to overcome any uncertainty or risk that the players take in the actions that they do. Introduce, especially with a player who's never played a tabletop role-playing game before, understanding that that is the loop of D&D, that is the pattern of the game. Taking your time with that is really good, because oftentimes a new player, you can set the scene and you'll turn it over to the player and say, what do you do? And the first time that happens for a new player, it can be daunting. And so allow yourself to soak in that interaction, like of the back and forth between you and that player. Allow them to figure out, oh, okay, so this is how, because one of the things a new player doesn't know is, like, a new player doesn't know that you can't say, my character goes to the town, buys a horse, and rides away and becomes a prince. You can't just say that you did all that. What a new player has to learn is how D&D chunks things into pockets of time as they're described. And so by giving yourself the space to do that, I think it'll be positive. Ask a new player to commit to 2 sessions.
Cool. 7:56. What do you think? Do we have time for one more? Is there one?
I think we can take one more question here. I think that a good one here might be one of our. Let's see. Do you have one? Yeah, let's take one more. Tristan, I like, how do you deal with players with 20 plus passive perception? I'm just gonna say, we've talked about this before, I think, on a few things, but I just want to say, let the player be good at the thing. Let them be good at the thing. They made their character to not be surprised. Remember that passive perception doesn't mean that you have supernatural sense to see the world all around you. You still have to interact with the environment. Passive perception 20 doesn't let you know that the key is taped under the desk. You still have to reach down there and look.
Passive, but yeah, that's something that is important. Is if a character has built themselves in a way that is strong in a certain category, that is probably the fantasy that they want to play. And so robbing them of that is never going to be a good thing, because characters want to be good at the things they're good at.
But the meta of D&D has made perception more powerful than it deserves to be.
You should watch our video on how to handle perception checks in D&D, because we actually do address this. But I will say that I actually very heavily separate when I use passive perception and when I ask for a perception roll. And I do not let the two interfere. If I'm asking for a perception roll and my player says, well, I have a passive perception of 20, I usually say, I'm not asking about that right now. I'm giving you a situation where you need to be extra aware. It's not something that you're passively aware of. It's something that you notice this thing happening? Sometimes passive perception will allow them to spot a creature who's sneaking, ruining the sneak attack that they were about to get. But passive perception is not going to allow them to find the secret door. They need to, if it's something that they're actively looking for, I ask for a perception roll. If it's something that is just happening around them, then maybe passive perception comes into play. They might have a good perception score regardless, but asking for a roll always has a chance of failing.
Yeah.
And so separating those two elements and just remembering, you still, as the DM, get to decide when you ask for a roll, when you want to use passive perception. When you are using passive perception, let that player be the one who doesn't get surprised. Maybe the rest of the party does. Often when you're rolling stealth for a character who's about to attack, I let that monster get surprise on anybody who didn't notice, but not on the people who did. It does shift things a little bit, but it can work that way.
Yeah. Well, with that, thank you to our patrons and all of you in chat for sending out so many amazing questions for our Q&A. We will be having more Q&As coming up over the coming weeks. Kelly and I will be doing a stay tuned. If you backed our Drakenheim Kickstarter or are a patron of our work, we will be doing a special Drakenheim Q&A for those that are running the Drakenheim campaign as an add-on to our video series, our video guide to Drakenheim. So stay tuned for that coming up. As well as we will be having our homebrew workshop returning shortly. I think we're going to do spells
I
for the
think
next
so,
homebrew
yeah.
workshop. Yeah. So if you're interested in the homebrew workshop series, patrons, start homebrewing your spells, because that's what we're going to be looking for next time. We want to see the magic.
Yeah, thanks to everybody who submitted questions this evening. I know we didn't get a chance to get to all of them. We rarely are able to get to all of them. But for all of you who submitted questions, thank you so much. Your questions were awesome. Obviously, keep playing some D&D. Keep coming to us with your questions. If you join our Patreon and you hop into our Discord, there is an Ask the Dudes channel. We try to keep up with it. I won't lie. We get a lot of questions sometimes in there, and sometimes Monty and I are not paying attention, but we try to be on there as often as we can, and we try to answer as many questions as we can. We're probably not going to read over your entire campaign setting and Ask the Dudes, but if you hop into our Discord and just ask like, what's your favorite class in D&D, or
What kind of
what do you
sushi
think
burritos do you like?
Yeah, what kind of sushi burritos do you like?
Oh,
or
man.
What multi-class should I make with this character? We're happy to answer all sorts of questions.
I got a great sushi place right now. Me and my partner, when we order sushi night, it's like we got it right down to a science. Oh man,
I'm so jealous. I haven't had sushi in years, and we need to have sushi sometime.
I haven't had sushi in hours. We had sushi last night. We were like checked out, right? But we actually now have to have reasonable sushi, which is where we don't order the massive party platter. We just get a reasonable amount of sushi. I'll let your imagination decide what a reasonable amount of sushi looks like.
It's still too much sushi.
Yeah. We will have the submissions open for the homebrewing spells probably up in another couple weeks. But just let that percolate until then. As always, we got our new videos Tuesdays and Thursdays. Drakenheim is currently on hiatus, but stay tuned for more information about upcoming live stream. With that, thank you all so much. This was so much fun. We will see you next time
In the dungeon.